The 2023-24 NFL season ended poorly for many NFL teams. Today, let's talk about the 5 teams whose season did end poorly, who I have major concerns with moving forward. Now, I know there's a lot of teams who we do have concerns moving forward with, but these 5 teams specifically, in my personal opinion, have a little bit more to be worried about than the other teams that aren't on this list. So with that being said, we are going to begin with the Jacksonville Jaguars. I feel like this is arguably the easiest one to just get out of the way. They had a ton of problems going down the backstretch of their season last year, and with major concerns on the defensive side of things, mainly in their secondary and defensive line, and of course in their receiving room offensively, I think that there's a lot of question marks this team has to answer this offseason. And I think the biggest question that needs to be answered this offseason is Trevor Lawrence really the guy? Trevor Lawrence, through the past couple of seasons, hasn't really been the best quarterback that we thought he could be, and some of that is his fault, and some of it, of course, is not his fault. Some of the things he can't really control, like Urban Meyer being his head coach, and of course, the defense being god-awful. But with that being said, when you're taking with the number 1 overall pick, there's a certain level of expectations that you have to meet, and I just don't know if he's really met those expectations thus far. Thus far, through his short career, he only has 11,770 passing yards to go along with only 58 touchdowns and 39 interceptions. Now, again, you do have to understand that there's a lot of circumstances that we haven't mentioned, but at least from my opinion, he's been a tad bit disappointing given the hype that he was given. Now, that's not me saying that he has no potential and that he will never reach his potential. In fact, I would vouch to say he is one of the most talented quarterbacks in the NFL. The problem with Trevor Lawrence is he hasn't been given the circumstances for him to work with, and when he does have the good circumstances around him, he hasn't performed up to expectation. And I think moving forward, obviously Trevor Lawrence will be the starting quarterback, but I definitely do want to see steps in the right direction from him next year. To me, there's no excuse for this team to not win the division next year. I understand that CJ Stroud and the Texans and Anthony Richardson and the Colts look great, but the Jaguars should have all the pieces and everything in the recipe to be good. And to me, that's part of the reason why I'm a little bit concerned about the Jacksonville Jaguars. Last year was the easiest year they're probably ever going to have. They had a division with 3 rookie quarterbacks, yet they still finished second. And with those rookie quarterbacks taking steps forward next year, it just makes me a little bit more concerned about the Jaguars' future. CJ Stroud was an MVP candidate through a lot of last year, Anthony Richardson looked legit in his short amount of games played, and Will Levis also had moments of greatness. I'm not going to sit up here and say that any of those guys are better than Trevor Lawrence quite yet, because they've only played 1 rookie year, but I think it's pretty safe to say that CJ Stroud has a brighter future than Trevor Lawrence, and I'd vouch to say so does Anthony Richardson and even potentially Will Levis. I think there's a lot of things he has to answer, and I think a lot of those questions should be answered next year. Let's go ahead and move on to my next team, and that is going to be the Cleveland Browns. Last year, the Cleveland Browns had a surprisingly good year, all things considered, based off all the injuries they had. But my question to that is, can they take the next step to win playoff games and make that deep run they so desperately want to hit? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that right now, and based off everything that I've been seeing and watching on the field, I have a hard time imagining them really taking that next step. Because yes, they have the pieces both offensively and defensively, but I think they have question marks in arguably the most important position, and that is the quarterback position. Love what Joe Flacco was able to do, but long term, he has no answer for that position, and of course, it's going to be Deshaun Watson's spot to fill. While Deshaun Watson has obviously shown some flashes here and there, he just has not looked like the same guy we saw in Houston. And this is now technically year 2 of the Deshaun Watson experiment, and I would say thus far, it hasn't really panned out the way I think the Browns thought it would. Similar to Trevor Lawrence, I'm not just ready to sit out here and just completely write off Deshaun Watson, because I think that's super unfair to do to him. I think his potential is through the roof, and I think if he can fit within the system of the Browns, I think it could be nice. I also think it's very important for us to mention the Browns faced so many injuries last year, not just from one guy or 2 important guys, but basically every single important player faced injuries. And while I'm not necessarily concerned about guys like Myles Garrett or Amari Cooper or other offensive linemen, I am big time concerned for guys like Nick Chubb, Deshaun Watson, and several of the guys on the defensive side of things who had injuries. It's hard to come back from a season-ending injury and just come back and play like your normal self. But I think moving forward, the questions that the Browns are going to have to answer is Deshaun Watson really the guy? Can Kevin Stefanski lead a team to the Super Bowl? And can they come back from their injuries? I think if they can answer those questions, that would obviously head them in the right direction, but until next year happens, I have some major concerns. Next up, I have the Buffalo Bills. Now, the Buffalo Bills have a very talented roster with a ton of great guys. As long as Josh Allen is playing on the Buffalo Bills, they're going to continuously have a chance to win the Super Bowl. My big concern is this: the Buffalo Bills have been running for that Super Bowl every single year, and they have not reached it. This was the year in which the AFC was probably at its weakest, and the Buffalo Bills failed. Moving forward, it's not like things are going to get any easier. The Kansas City Chiefs will get better, so will teams like the Baltimore Ravens, the Houston Texans, the Colts, so on and so forth. You're a Buffalo Bills team that's built to win now, and you haven't won anything notable. That is very concerning. You could say the same thing for a lot of teams that I did not put on this list, but I mainly wanted to put the Buffalo Bills in here because they've been at this for the past couple years and nothing has really came from it. For example, you could probably throw the Baltimore Ravens in this video as well, but the Ravens really haven't been contending for Super Bowls till this year, so I'm kind of willing to wait it out. There's a couple NFC teams like the Cowboys and the Niners who have also been trying to win a Super Bowl, but they haven't reached that goal quite yet, but at least for them, the NFC isn't really blooming with young talent. Whereas in the AFC, you have many teams like the New York Jets, the Houston Texans, the Indianapolis Colts, and even some really young teams like the Tennessee Titans who might be really good within the next couple years who could potentially replace the Buffalo Bills. I believe the Buffalo Bills might struggle to win the championship because you already have great players now like Patrick Mahomes and Joe Burrow who are constantly going for that Super Bowl, but you're also going to have guys 5 to 10 years from now who are also going to be contending for that Super Bowl spot. And with the AFC basically running through the Kansas City Chiefs, I just don't really see a path in which the Buffalo Bills can get so much better where they can beat the Kansas City Chiefs and win the AFC Championship. Now again, with Josh Allen, you always have a chance, but I think there's a lot of question marks around him on this roster that needs to get seriously addressed. Because we've already started to see the rumors of guys like Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis potentially leaving. In some ways, that could be a positive thing, but Stephon Diggs is a all-pro level receiver for a reason, and I think if we're just going to say it's okay that a all-pro level wide receiver is leaving, I think there's some more questions we got to ask ourselves. But I do believe they can answer some questions this offseason. I think they'll always have a chance, and while it may not be fair to put this team in and not have some other teams in, I do think the Buffalo Bills are the prime example of a team that I am worried about. Let us now move on to the Minnesota Vikings. Just 2 years ago, the Minnesota Vikings were one of the more promising teams in the NFL after they had a spectacular year, winning over double-digit games and making it to the playoffs. Then we all know what happened. They would lose to the New York Giants and everything would just sort of fall apart on them when it came to the playoffs. But long term, the Vikings had a relatively bright future. Justin Jefferson was playing fantastic, the defense was getting better, you got Jordan Addison, Kirk Cousins is still there. Moving forward, the team looked like it was going in the right direction. But then last year unfolded, and of course, the Kirk Cousins injury basically melted down every chance they had of potentially making a playoff run. But even before Kirk Cousins was injured, they weren't really playing good football. And I think moving forward, the biggest question the Minnesota Vikings will have to answer is Kirk Cousins the quarterback, or will they potentially trade up for a guy like Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, Michael Penix, or one of these young quarterbacks of this year's draft? Last year, there was obviously a ton of rumors and speculations that Anthony Richardson was the guy they were going for, and of course that didn't happen, so gotta kind of wonder what the answer will be at the quarterback position given what they've been trying to do. And the major thing with the Minnesota Vikings is they're in a super tough division. The Chicago Bears are going to get better, the Detroit Lions looked fantastic last year, and the Green Bay Packers even looked great themselves. And with the Minnesota Vikings not necessarily having a young team but not also having an old team, it's kind of a weird spot to be in for them. Do you go out there and get a guy like a Kirk Cousins to stay for another year, or do you go out and get a Russell Wilson to try to be the quarterback? Probably not. I don't think that's quite the answer, but at the same time, this is a team that's built to compete now, and going out there and getting a young, fresh new quarterback this team back a few years. Not to mention, Justin Jefferson is due a massive contract this offseason, and I guarantee you he should and will be the #1 paid wide receiver in the NFL. And if you're the Minnesota Vikings, having a big chunk of your cap space go to one player could seriously hinder different pieces on this defense and offense. And when you're a team that's already looking to acquire more talent, it's going to be very hard when you have so much money built up into one player. Not to mention, if you were to go out there and get a Russell Wilson or a Kirk Cousins, you still have to pay those guys a big sum of money. Now, what I will say about this Minnesota Vikings team is this. Number one, they have a great head coach, and I think defensively they got significantly better from last year. But I also don't know if those pieces are good enough to seriously have this team compete with a younger quarterback in. Not to mention, if they are hypothetically to go in there and try to get one of the top 3 quarterbacks of this year's draft, they're going to have to give up a ton of draft capital to move up. If I'm Minnesota Vikings, you're going to have to at least give up 3, maybe 4 first-round picks to move up in that top 3. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but you get my point. And while I think all 3 of those quarterbacks would be worth it to some extent, I also don't know if the Minnesota Vikings would be that smart to do that. And with an NFC that is going to only get better, it just feels like the Minnesota Vikings are kind of straying away from the pack of being playoff contenders. Again, with some good players on the roster, they're going to continuously be in that contention to win a lot of games and potentially make it to a playoff spot, but I seriously do wonder what this team's future really holds and if they can truly be playoff contenders consistently. Now, before I get to my very last team, I want to give a special shout out to the sponsor of today's video, Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy is the easiest and fastest growing fantasy sports app available. I know the NFL season may be over, however, Underdog has plenty of ways to entertain us while we wait for the new season. You may not know this about me, but I am a massive NBA fan, and with Underdog's Pick'em games, I can earn some serious cash. Simply pick higher or lower on 2 to 5 player stats, and you'll have a chance to win up to 20 times your your money in a single night. I personally love playing these pick'em games on game day to spice up my afternoon. And all you have to do is use the link in the description below to sign up today using promo code MetroSports, and you can get your first deposit doubled up to $100 as well as an instant pick'em special. Check the map on the screen right now to see if your state qualifies, and I want to give a massive thank you to Underdog for sponsoring today's video. But let's go ahead and move on to the very last team, and it is of course the Philadelphia Eagles. The Philadelphia Eagles have a ton of problems they need to look to address this offseason, mainly within the defense. Their secondary isn't very young with guys like Darius Slay, James Bradbury, and Kevin Byard. And I think moving forward in this year's draft, they have to seriously look at that position as a position of need. Fortunately for them, there should be several young cornerbacks and safeties in this year's draft who they can take with their first, second, and third round picks. But I also don't know if any of those guys will come in there and be better than what they already have. Now, what I will say about the Philadelphia Eagles is their schemes last year really did not highlight what their players are good at, but with the guys they took in this year, I don't really know if they do the same thing either. I've obviously made my voice very heard about the Kellen Moore hire and how I hate that hire for the Philadelphia Eagles, and while several people might disagree with that, I'm going to stick on what I said and say that Kellen Moore is not a good hire for the Philadelphia Eagles. And while yes, he's going to be better than what they had last year, I just don't know if it's quite the guy that they've had in the past. And while yes, he's going to be better than what they had last year, I just don't know if it's good enough to take this team to a Super Bowl, which is obviously where they want to be. I think many fans are just happy that he's slightly better, but I think this team is ready to compete now, and to go out there and just get somebody who I think is slightly better but still not great is kind of silly. Now, I'm not saying you go out there and you fire your head coach and you fire this and this and that after one bad year, but I am saying that the replacements they got for the guys they had were kind of suspect. And this is the same question I had with them last offseason. They had a lot of overhauling they had to do with both their offensive coordinator and their defensive coordinator, and a lot of personnel on defense. And to me, it feels like in a lot of ways, we're heading towards a very similar offseason yet again. Yet again, a new offensive coordinator will step in, a new defensive coordinator will step in. There's going to be several new players on this defense, and I just don't know how that's going to be, given that the Dallas Cowboys, the San Francisco 49ers, the Jordan Love-led Green Bay Packers, the Detroit Lions, the Chicago Bears, so on and so forth, are all going to be hopefully better next year. Now, here's the thing. Philadelphia will likely make the playoffs next year, but I do have some serious concerns about this team's long-term future. I like Jalen Hurts, and I think he's a great quarterback, but I just don't know if he's quite the quarterback who can carry a bad system. I'm not saying he was a product of the Shane Steichen system at all. I think he has very good abilities to be great in any system, but I think last year we also saw a lot of the inabilities of Jalen Hurts himself. So while I'm not necessarily concerned about Jalen Hurts as a player long term, I am seriously concerned about this Philadelphia Eagles team, and with more players coming out and voicing their concerns for this franchise as well, I think I have good reason to be concerned. Now, these are just 5 teams who I think have major concerns. Every team heading into the offseason should have big time concerns they should look to address, but in my opinion, these were the top 5 teams that I am worried about.